Okay, so it's 6:30. Good evening and welcome to Hackney's Planning Committee. My name's Councillor Vincent Stocks. I should be chairing this evening's meeting. Apologise again for those people I can't see because of this camera system in front of us here, but you're very welcome. You can't hear? Can you hear, members? If you want to come down to the front row in that other block there. You can all move forward. Yes, please. And there are spare seats there as well. Just. Okay, so good evening and welcome to Hackney's Planning Committee. That's a good introduction. Please speak loud and clearly. The council will be recording this meeting and it's being live streamed on YouTube. We're now back in person. Councillors voting this evening and are here in the chamber, and we'll be undertaking the meeting as close a fashion as we can to our normal format of these meetings. Some officers are taking part remotely to allow social distancing in the chamber and for as many public to get here as they can. The virtual meeting technology has a chat function. Please only use the function to raise technology issues. I certainly won't be monitoring it. In the event of an internet outage, we'll adjourn and try and get back up as soon as we can. I'd first like to introduce members. Councillors Young, Hanson, Bell, Joseph and Race. There are our head of planning to my left, Gareth, who some of you will have talked to about speaking this evening, is the committee officer, and over there we've got our legal officer, Christine. There are applicants here, some in person and some joining us remotely, and the same with objectors. We've got a remote objector, I think. Before moving to the agenda, can I take 2 minutes to explain how the meeting will proceed? We'll hear each application summarised by the officers. He's remote. A 5-minute statement from objectors, followed by a 5-minute statement from the applicant. Members will then be free to ask questions. It's my role to make sure that members have all the information they need to make a decision. Objectors and applicants have their say, and that the meeting runs properly. I'll not be taking any contribution from the floor. This is a meeting in public, not a public meeting. You must have given notice to the Government Service Officer before the meeting by registering to speak. As I've said, objectors and applicants will have strictly 5 minutes. If there's more than one of you, you need to decide amongst yourselves how you'll split that time. Members are not representing either their wards nor their political parties. We make our decisions on the basis of any site visits we've made, what we've read in the reports, and of course what we hear this evening. We must only take account of policies adopted by this council, other material planning policies and material planning considerations. Can I emphasise that members should not discuss nor take account of non-material planning matters? Members making the decision should not have allowed themselves to prejudge any application prior to the meeting. Similarly, if they have any interest in the application site or the people involved, they should declare that interest and may remove themselves from the decision. When we've finished our deliberations, we'll vote on the recommendation. When the decision is made, that's the end of the matter for the committee ordinarily. As we know, not in this case. The applicant may appeal our decision to the Secretary of State and objectors may seek legal redress. I'd advise you to take professional advice in either case. Finally, we'll be taking a break where we can, or we would normally. I think we'll work through, well, we might take a break. It might be a slow, long meeting. I'll target the break for 8 p.m. And see where we are at that time. Now, can we move to the agenda? So we have apologies for absence.
Chair, I have apologies from Councillor Charahan and Councillor Levy. I haven't received apologies. Councillor Garcia given her apologies.
I haven't seen.
Okay. And just on a point of clarification, Chair, you said that somebody from the objector side was joining virtually. Is actually Gareth Turner from the supporting side. He's the viability consultant. He's joining remotely.
Okay, yes. Okay.
Gareth Turner.
So declarations of interest, are there any? Councillor Race.
Thank you. I think along with most of the members of the committee, I've received email correspondence from various people advocating for or against the application.
Thank
Pass
you.
them
I
on.
think we all may have. Any other members' declarations of interest?
It's a minor one, but I personally know one of the objectors, not anybody who's speaking. So I know John
Say
Spiteri.
again, could you?
I know one of the objectors who's written to object personally. His
Okay.
name's John Spiteri.
By no, do you,
I mean, he's a
are you
very
close?
close family friend. I
Close
haven't
family-
spoken to him about this.
Okay. Do you want to take any advice from Christine? Yes, you need to put it on. Bottom right. There you go.
Sorry. At the end of the day, so long as you're satisfied within yourself that you haven't predetermined, you haven't come to any conclusion, you haven't discussed anything with the objector itself, and that you've kept an open mind and that you're going to listen to the documents and what's being said tonight, and that I think it's up to you at the end of the day to be satisfied that you haven't predetermined and made any judgment as such.
Thank you, I'm content.
Okay. To consider any proposal questions, I just wanted to say that there was a query came out of last meeting about whether members could take part in the meeting remotely but not vote. That is not possible. So the ruling was correct that you need to actually be here in order to speak and in order to vote, of course. So that was clarified by our legal officer. Minutes of the previous meeting. I don't think we've got any, have we? I haven't got any. Okay. So on to 49 to 50 Eagle Wharf. Over to you, please, Barry.
Thank you, Chair. Let me know if you can't hear me or if it's too low, okay? Share my screen. Can members see the presentation?
It was a bit speakers here. 1 minute, Gareth. Barry, could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Barry Coughlin. I'm the Deputy Team Leader of the Major Projects team.
A little bit louder. And again.
My name is Barry Coughlin. I'm the Deputy Team Leader of the Major Projects team.
Okay, that'll do. That'll do. Thank you. Okay, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. This item relates to 49 to 50 Eagle Wharf Road. The site is roughly rectangular in shape and is located on the northern side of Eagle Wharf Road. It's bounded by the Regent's Canal to the north. The site is located within the Wenlock Priority Office Area, the City Fringe Office Area, the Regent's Canal Conservation Area, and the Arlington Square Conservation Area. This is an aerial view which gives you a view of the site within its surrounding context. This is the site within the centre of the image. You can see the surrounding context is mixed in nature with predominantly, this is looking south, predominantly residential uses to the south, a mixture of residential and commercial to the west, an existing self-storage facility to the east, which has recently obtained a resolution to grant planning permission for a 2 to 7 story building with 139 residential units and office and storage space. To the north in the Londonderry of Islington is predominantly residential uses, including the Arlington Square Conservation Area that I mentioned. You can see the prevailing heights are in the region of 2 to 6, 7 stories. These are the site photos. This is a photo from the Regent's Canal looking east. It's the north elevation of the existing buildings. You can see the various types of building that are comprised on the site. This is a view from the northern side of the canal looking in the opposite direction, looking west. Again, you can see the existing buildings on site, including the chimney structure. These are some photos from Eagle Wharf Road. The first one is looking east along Eagle Wharf Road. You can see the access points for vehicles there. And then the one on the right is looking west on Eagle Wharf Road. And you can see the character of the building on its Eagle Wharf Road elevation. This is a couple of views of the internal courtyard, which is accessed from Eagle Wharf Road. The main access to Holborn Studios is from this courtyard and the other businesses within the buildings. These are some internal shots. So as I mentioned, the current site is occupied predominantly by Holborn Studios, which is a photography studio. The image on the left is an interior view, which shows you it's an access point for vehicles from Eagle Wharf Road, which is one of the particular characteristics of the site and how it's suited to the current occupier. The image on the right is an example of one of the smaller photography studios they have on site. This image shows one of the larger photography studios and one of the infinity coves that are on site. You give you a sense of the scale of such spaces there. And this is a couple of photos which show you some of the interiors of the more standard office accommodation that's provided on site. So there are a number of other businesses aside from Eagle Wharf, Holborn Studios, which occupy the space. So before I present the scheme, I think it's important to just go through some of the background in relation to the judicial review. So in 2015, an application obtained planning permission, but a judicial review was mounted in 2017 and the permission was quashed. This was due to a lack of consultation on certain changes to the application and a failure to publish certain documents online. Subsequently, a new application was submitted in 2017, which again obtained a resolution to grant planning permission in January 2019, and permission was issued late that year. A judicial review was again mounted, and on this occasion, the permission was quashed due to a failure on the council's part to make all relevant information in relation to financial viability publicly available and a lack of clear and comprehensive viability information. There were two other grounds for judicial review which were dismissed by the judge. The application before members this evening seeks to address the reason for the 2020 judicial review permission being quashed. In order to do so, the submission includes some additional viability information, which has been published online, and the submission of updated submitted documents to reflect the current policy context. The scheme is broadly similar in terms of land use, scale, and massing. There have been some minor changes necessitated by the updated policy context. That mainly relates to the commercial floor area, which is reduced by 53 square meters, and various changes to the obligations and contributions, which I'll reference later on in my presentation. For these reasons, my report is mainly concerned with the changes to policy context that have occurred since the application was last presented to members in 2019, and it should be read in conjunction with the January 2019 report, which was appended to my report. At this point, I would also like to draw members' attention to the addendum, which includes a summary of various objections received prior to committee, but following the publication of the agenda, as well as some minor clarifications and corrections. Moving on to the scheme, as I mentioned, it's broadly similar to that which was previously presented to members. It still involves the partial demolition of the existing buildings on site, the retention of the three-storey L-shaped building and former industrial chimney, and the redevelopment of the site in blocks of 2 to 7 stories to provide 5,591 square meters of commercial floor space and 50 residential units. This next image just shows you the existing buildings on site, so you get a sense of what is being lost and what's being retained. So you can see the L-shaped building I mentioned nearest the canal is being retained along with the chimney, but the rest of the buildings on site are being demolished and replaced with buildings of varying heights, including some 2 to 3 story blocks which connect the former the warehouse buildings to the newer parts of the development, as well as part 4, part 5, part 6, part 7 story aspects of the development. This is a view looking north. You can get a sense of the front elevation of the building on Eagle Wharf Road, the building within its context. You can also see here the provision of courtyard space, as well as some of the provision for PV photovoltaic cells on the roof and green roofs. This is a ground floor plan where you can see the layout of commercial uses on the ground floor. That includes a cafe within the annotated in blue here, the yellow spaces of the commercial space. You can also see the layout of the site and the extent of internal courtyards that are to be provided, as well as that the additional hard standing and landscaping to be provided alongside the canal. These are some indicative floor plans, which just shows you how the scheme is laid out. The commercial uses are in the orange colour, and the residential are the blue, light blue, green and light yellow. And again, moving up towards the higher floors of the building. And again, you can see the kind of layout of the scheme and the roof plan. These are some sections and elevations showing the scheme within its context. You can see how it's broadly consistent with the prevailing context. It's slightly taller in some respects than the building to the east, but similar in height to the building that's recently achieved a resolution to grant planning permission at the site to the east. This is an elevation from the south elevation on Eagle Wharf Road. You can see again the heights within their context on the street. You can see how vehicular access is provided through undercrofts and get a sense of the general approach to the architecture of the scheme. The section below gives you an impression of how the scheme relates to the canal in terms of its proportions and also a sense of the extent of basement excavation. So I'll run through some of the CGIs to give you an impression of the visual impact of the scheme. So this is a view from the northern side of the canal, looking south, and this is the scheme with the scheme in place. So you get a sense of the approach to architecture, the materiality of the scheme, and the extent of the buildings to be retained. This is also from the northern side, but looking east, and with the scheme in place. So you get a sense of how it integrates into its surroundings. This is a view from Eagle Wharf Road, looking east, and again with the scheme in place. So again, you can see how it integrates with its surroundings and the approach to architecture. Overall, the design of the scheme is considered by officers to be acceptable and of a high quality. I'll cover the loss of the existing buildings in just a second. This is an image showing the canal landscaping, so you can see how the scheme has been laid out at ground floor level and the provision of additional landscaping. That would be tree planting and shrubs and planting of other landscaping within the different courtyards as well as on the canal. And this not only improves the landscaping of the scheme, but it increases biodiversity compared to the existing situation. There's a couple of images below which give you an impression as to how the scheme would look on the canal with some of those existing buildings removed and a greater extent of open space provided. These are some further images which should give you an idea as to the character of the courtyard spaces. So turning to the proposed commercial space, one of the key changes in policy that's referenced in my report is an updated approach to the proportion of commercial space that should be sought in the Wenlock priority employment area, whereas previously it sought majority floor space to be employment-led. It now seeks 60% subject to viability. In this case, the scheme provides 54.2% of the scheme as commercial, which is slightly below the policy target, but viability information has been submitted and officers are satisfied that the maximum reasonable amount, maximum economically feasible amount of employment floor space has been provided. In terms of the quality of the accommodation, again, officers are satisfied that the quality is of an acceptable standard in terms of layout, provision of natural light. There are some basement spaces which aren't provided with windows, but officers are of the view that because of the nature of the intended occupiers as studio space, that the space is of an acceptable standard. In terms of the existing cultural use on site, it's acknowledged that the Holborn Studios is a valuable cultural asset, and officers are aware of the extent of support that this facility has. However, while the new floor space to be provided might not necessarily meet the specific operational requirements of Holborn Studios, its design and nature does not preclude the occupation of the space by another similar cultural occupier. And this is a similar issue as to that which was challenged at the judicial review, and a similar sort of outcome was arrived at. Just moving on briefly to the loss of the existing buildings. So the image on the bottom of the screen gives you an impression as to the extent of the buildings to be lost. The the existing buildings on site are designated as buildings of townscape merit in the conservation area appraisal. The terminology we now use are positive contributors to the conservation area. However, officers believe that the buildings to be retained are those of the highest quality, and overall, the public benefits of the scheme justify the extent of harm that will be caused to the heritage assets. So just to summarise briefly the key changes to the scheme. So as I mentioned before, the commercial floor area has reduced by 53 square metres. This is mainly due to additional cycle parking and energy and sustainability needs that are required due to updated policy context. The affordable workspace provision has been amended, reduced from 24% of commercial floor space at 80% of market rates to 11.5% of commercial floor space at 60% of market rates. So while the proportion has reduced, the extent of the discount has increased. This remains an exceedance of policy. Policy seeks 10% of the commercial floor space at 60% of market rates. And given that it would secure the affordable workspace in perpetuity, where no such arrangement currently exists, is considered to be a key benefit of the scheme. The affordable housing contribution has been reduced compared to the scheme that was presented to members in January 2019. The figure was previously £757,076 and is now £157,823. The reason for this reduction is due to an updated appraisal based on the current viability context, but also changes to planning contributions that have arisen since then, as well as the inclusion of some tenant compensation costs and other matters discussed in my report in more detail. Officers have robustly scrutinised the viability information provided and believe that this is the maximum viable amount that can be provided, bearing in mind the scheme's employment designation and the priority to provide employment floor space in the first instance. As I mentioned, SIL and carbon offsetting contributions have increased compared to the previous report. Overall, the wider submission has been updated to reflect current policy context. So the policies have changed since it was last presented to members in January 2019. The London plan has been published last year, and Hackney published adopted its local plan in 2021. So an example of some of the updated standards include a need to meet urban greening factor requirements, biodiversity net gain, and in all these respects, officers believe that the scheme remains acceptable and is in line with current policy. It's worth pointing out that the development description has been amended slightly compared to the 2019 report due to the changes to the use class order. Effectively, the new use class is EG1, which remains similar to the B1 use class that was previously proposed. And officers are of the view that the studio spaces which currently occupy the site or similar studio uses could occupy the new space within this use class. So just to summarize briefly, the updated viability information provided or published online is considered transparent, comprehensive, and coherent. So for this reason, officers believe that the reason for the previous decision being quashed has been addressed. The proposal is considered otherwise acceptable in relation to the current policy context and site circumstances as set out in the officer's report and in the appended report from January 2019. The scheme is broadly similar to that found acceptable by members in January 2019 in terms of scale and massing, the loss of the existing building, and the reprovision of cultural space. Members may choose to come to a different decision on this application on this occasion. However, the previous resolution to grant is a material planning consideration, and the council may be vulnerable to criticisms of unreasonableness if a different decision were to be made without a significant change in circumstances to justify a different decision. So with that, my recommendation is to grant planning permission subject to conditions and the completion of legal agreement. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Barry. If we could move on now to the objectors. So Kieran, I think you're going first, and Richard afterwards. You've got 5 minutes between you. Is somebody timing? Okay, please, Kieran.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, councillors. My name's Kieran Hodgson, and I'm a planning consultant here on behalf of Holborn Studios. I'm objecting this evening to this planning application. As you're aware, councillors, this is the third attempt the applicant has had in seeking to evict the studios on the grounds of redevelopment, the previous two resolutions having been quashed successfully in the High Court. And on that simple basis, we find it absolutely astonishing that officers are again, for a third time, recommending you grant planning permission. The world has moved on enormously since members last resolved on this issue. We've had a COVID pandemic, of course, but the policy framework has changed significantly as well. We've had a new planning policy framework nationally. We've had a new London plan. And of course, importantly, we've had a new Hackney local plan. All of that has resulted in a huge shift in the policy framework. These proposals, which are a cut and paste of the previous application, do not reflect your current policies. They don't respond to your latest local plan. They don't achieve the very high bar members have rightly set for good development in Hackney. Our concerns are shared by many and are fourfold principally, and we just wanted to briefly summarise our key grounds for concern. The first one is in relation to employment. As officers said in their presentation, this is a site which is located in an office priority area. The focus here is for employment floor space. This scheme should be employment-led. It isn't. It needs to provide a minimum of 60% commercial floor area. It does not. It fails that policy test. This is a scheme where we're really concerned that the employment quantum is effectively a foil to justify planning permission for a large number of expensive flats. That's our main concern. This is not an employment-led scheme. When it comes to culture, as you know, the Holborn Studios have been in this location for 35 years and are responsible almost entirely for the creation and curation of this particular part of Hackney, which is cherished so locally. The studios deliver many jobs. It's a creative hub, an internationally recognised centre of excellence for photography and the creative arts. And these proposals would sadly result in the total destruction of the studios and everything they've achieved in partnership with Hackney over many years. There's an assumption made in the officer report and inferred briefly in Barry's presentation there that the studios, well, they could just reoccupy the newly built space. They couldn't for all the reasons we've set out in our objections. We also wanted to talk about affordable housing, and I've used the reference Trojan horse already. The concern we have here is that if members are seeking to sacrifice your own policies in relation to employment and employment-led, and let the applicant get away with a scheme which is not employment-led as it should be, the least we could hope for is a scheme which makes a meaningful contribution to affordable housing. It doesn't. £152,000 as a financial contribution, we feel is shameful in the context of a scheme of this size, where the applicant's proposing substantial new build elements. Lastly, in terms of heritage, we feel this scheme is really harmful when it comes to local heritage. The studios again feel particularly strongly about this because they rescued the existing buildings from dereliction 35 years ago. The site, as you know, is an identified building of merit. We're located within a conservation area or adjacent to an additional conservation area. Substantial demolition is proposed, and these are the last buildings which retain their original relationship with the canal. So we're really concerned about heritage in addition. There are four main concerns. I'll now hand over to Richard Harwood, QC.
Thank you. Some familiar faces from the last time. The scheme fails policy on the amount of employment floor space, on preserving low-cost employment floor space for businesses who want to stay, on avoiding office space in basements with no natural light. As we've heard, it won't be used as studios. It's a zero affordable housing scheme. It causes harm to the conservation area, which gives rise to a strong statutory presumption to refuse. In terms of cultural policies, those are entirely new and those are strongly against the scheme. We were debating cultural effects in terms of general employment policies last time, not the current cultural policies we have. The GLA cultural unit is very strongly opposed. Now, you can refuse on the basis of all those breaches. It's not for the developer to say, as it inevitably has to be their position, that their scheme is harmful because anything better is not viable. Planning's not there to deliver profits for developers, it's there for the public interest. And there is a better scheme on the site, and that, thank you, and that is to keep the current use.
Thank you. Okay, over to applicant, please, then. Just one of you, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair, subcommittee members. I'm Sean Meadows of GHL Eagle Wharf Limited, the company that is a joint venture between my company, Executech, Galliard Homes, ARV Investments and Landview Properties. We're all developers in our own right. We are not new partners and have successfully developed many sites over the past 25 years together. To list a few, 30 apartments at Clerkenwell County Court, 97 apartments at Clarendon Court Maida Vale, 66 apartments in the Little Adelphi. The list goes on and is quite substantial. Individually, we have numerous developments. Executech and Landview are currently under construction on 4 sites, and Galliard Homes are one of, if not the biggest developer in London, and hope this gives the committee some comfort they have ability to deliver. We purchased the building in September 2014. The previous owners had a live application to demolish the entire site and build new. We decided not to use that application and instructed our team to adopt a more sympathetic approach. We successfully gained a resolution to grant planning on the site at the end of 2017 and then again at the beginning of 2019. On both occasions, committee members gave the scheme their full support. However, these decisions were both subject to judicial reviews that were upheld. These details are, I believe, within the officer's report. The application before you today is a result of engagement with the Council and other key stakeholders, including Historic England, Hackney's Design Review Panel and the local community. The proposed employment-led development will safeguard the long-term future of employment uses and the building of the greatest historic significance. The scheme fully accords with the planning policy framework at all tiers, including the principles of sustainable development by optimising the use of the previously developed land. 54% of the total proposed floor space will be designed for employment uses. The proposed scheme, when compared to the existing building, will deliver 1,048 square metres of an additional net internal area for employment uses. The quality of employment floor space will be significantly improved by the proposed development. A range of unit sizes proposed which are flexible and capable of subdivision. The basement level has been designed to be capable of accommodating film and photography studios, as well as other employment uses. The uplift of proposed floor space presents an opportunity to retain any existing and attract new businesses to the site, and has the potential to generate approximately 320 jobs. Furthermore, 11.5% of the total commercial floor space will be provided as affordable workspace to be let in perpetuity at a discount of 60% on market rent. The residential component of the scheme will deliver 50 dwellings, of which 20% are 3 and 4 bed units suitable for family housing. The development will make a contribution towards assisting the borough and London in meeting its pressing housing targets. The 19th century warehouse fronting the Canal and the Chimney will be retained and restored, as these are the buildings of greatest architecture and historic interest. This approach has been supported by Historic England and the Council. The renovation of the most interesting historic buildings on the site will preserve and enhance the character and appearance of Regent's Canal Conservation Area. The loss of other buildings is outweighed by the benefits of the scheme, including the high design quality of the new buildings. The effect of the development upon the amenity and local residents has been assessed and are considered to be acceptable. The scheme comprises generous public realm, including 2 large courtyards for the use of businesses and residents of the scheme. The eastern courtyard will be open up a new public access between Eagle Wharf Road and the Canal. The generosity of the public realm and access along the canal will also be improved in light of these proposals. This proposal represents a sustainable development that accords with the key objectives set out in the NPPF and local policies. The planning benefits set out, including 1.64 million of SIL and Section 106 contributions, represents significant material considerations which on balance outweigh any harm created by the development. The scheme has not materially changed since our previous application, and we trust members will consider the merits of the development as did previous committees. We have a wonderful opportunity to not only develop one of the last warehouse buildings on the canal side, but to respect it, to renovate and enhance the site's most important heritage assets, to create sustainable modern workspace, new homes, and to open up the waterfront for the community to enjoy for years to come. We thank you for this opportunity and your time again this evening.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take couple of questions first, then I'll hand it over and we'll work through some of it quite slowly, I think. So we'll all get a chance to ask questions. I want to ask the first one, and that's this to Barry, really. Barry, we heard that this is a brave new world from Kieran. The nub of all of this is do our policies support the retention or reprovision of a bespoke studio space for Holborn Studios? That's what they've been asking for over the years, that they won't be able to use the space that's being provided. So could we sustain that position with our policies in place and the London Plan new policies compared to what we had before? And I'll come to the others perhaps to ask that same question.
Thank you, Chair. I think the short answer is that I don't think we could sustain refusal on that basis. The policy context in the local plan is quite similar in that there was protection afforded to cultural uses. The London Plan, the new London Plan, has expanded provision in relation to culture compared to the previous version. But again, it talks of protecting existing cultural venues, facilities and uses where appropriate. In this case, a cultural use would be re-provided, and while it may not be to the specific needs and operational requirements of Holborn Studios, I don't think officers don't believe that it would be reasonable grounds of refusal, given that it could accommodate another cultural occupier of a similar nature, perhaps not with exactly the same specific operational needs, but nevertheless a photography studio or similar cultural use. So for that reason, I think it's in compliance with policy.
Thank you. And what was the reference to the judgment in that respect?
Yeah, this is mentioned in my addendum, so I think it's probably worth referring to that key passage from the judgment. It's quoted at 5.3.14 in the addendum. I can read it out if it helps. It's important to observe that nowhere in any of the policies relied upon by the claimant does the need to protect the specific and bespoke use operated by the claimant and its particular requirements in relation to accommodation arise. To that extent, in my view, the officer's observation was not misleading, nor did it omit or misrepresent the relevant policies, which were rehearsed in the committee report. The officers were not suggesting that there was no policy relevant to the claimant's use, but that there was no policy specific to the claimant's use specifically. I think the situation remains the same. We acknowledge it's a cultural use, we acknowledge its value. However, we don't believe that we could refuse on the basis that the replacement space isn't suited to the particular requirements of a particular occupier.
Thank you. And my second question is about the judgment again, and it's this viability assessment issue. So we were judged not to have been open and transparent about the viability issues. I know that the regulations were changing at that time. I wonder, have you been challenged at all by the objectors in terms of our transparency and whether we've put all the stuff out there so far?
There was an initial objection on behalf of the studios, which queried whether or not the full extent of information was published online. It referenced one particular report, which didn't appear to be. That was subsequently put online and a reconsultation exercise was undertaken. The reconsultation exercise that happened just before this planning committee included all of the relevant information related to the planning viability assessment, and we've listed relevant background papers. In the most recent submission on behalf of the studio, they've queried whether or not the full extent of background papers has been listed, but I don't recall them having any specific problem with the information that's been published online. I don't recall there being any specific objection that it was incoherent, incomprehensible or incomplete. And I think in those respects, I think we have provided as comprehensive and as clear a picture of the viability assessment as we can. And I think it's intelligible and meets the relevant tests.
Kieran, have you got any more stuff you'd like to see?
Thank you, Chairman. There were some missing documents, which we requested from Barry recently and which he provided today. They consisted of legal letters as well as an assessment in relation to some of the energy strategy undertaken on behalf of the applicants. Those documents should have been put on the council's website and been subject to consultation, in my view, especially given the long history of this case and the previous issues associated with the judicial review, which was quashed on that precise lack of consultation reason. So that concerns us. It concerns us additionally because obviously in writing the report to members, those documents were relied upon to some extent in making the recommendation. So they should have been made publicly available for a similar level of scrutiny, in our view. I don't know whether Richard wanted to say anything else in addition to that.
Thank you. Just to add, one of the problems which there was on viability was trying to understand how the figures which have been put in front of the committee had been derived. And that same problem does arise here, that we have figures, even though, for example, the underlying lease on the site hasn't changed, where the developer's figures are different, the council starting figures are different, the agreed figures are only contained in a summary table, and it's not apparent how that's come about. As Karen has said, some of what were identified as background documents were not actually put on the website, were only made available to us late last night, several days after we'd asked for them. And so we have raised the question both as to whether there are other background documents in relation to viability, and also, it has to be said, the list of background documents, as members will have seen, simply refers to 4 documents, all of which relate to viability. Now, considerably more than 4 documents would have been relied upon by officers in compiling what is an extensive report. So we don't see that list as being complete.
Thank you then. I don't know if Barry or James, do you think that's substantive at all? Or is this just minimal?
I can respond to that, Chair. So the background documents listed were the sustainability report, which Kieran mentioned, which was a report that the council commissioned from an external consultant because we don't have a sustainability officer currently in post. So in effect, it's an internal consultation response. We've listed it as a background paper, and it was requested to provide that to the objector, and we provided it yesterday. So that's the first thing. In terms of the viability document that's listed, there's 3 documents. There's 2 of them are James's documents. One is a summary report, and one is his initial report based on the initial submission by the applicant. And the other documents listed they're referred to as solicitors' letters relating to the tenant compensation costs. So the 2 documents that James produced were published online and were consulted on throughout the process. But the solicitors' letters weren't published online, but due to their nature, they're confidential in the first respect. But also, the letters themselves are actually between the studio, who are objecting, and the applicant. The letters, they substantiate one input to the viability assessment, which relates to tenant compensation costs. That input is something that we've asked for that evidence to substantiate, but have also got a review mechanism within the heads of terms, so that if the eventual tenant compensation cost ends up being different, we'll be able to recoup any savings made there. So I think we've published everything that we use. That one document was listed as a background document and was made available upon request. So I think that everything that we based our decision on has been, either published or listed.
Okay, thank you. So that's my 2. What I'm going to suggest is we go to the 5.118, 5.2, and work through the considerations. If we do this slowly, everybody. So the principle of the development is the first one. And if we could take questions on those issues, that would be useful. So we've discussed most of this before. Any questions on the issues of the principle of development? Councillor Hanson.
Thank you, Chair. Feel free to tell me to raise this under another heading, but I was going to ask about this because, I mean, I am completely persuaded of the argument that we can't take the needs of a particular tenant into account. So we can't do what Mr. Harwood wanted, which is to sort of rule that the status quo must prevail, because, you know, obviously a fresh application can be made at any time, even were we to refuse this tonight. But I do think some of the issues that were raised, which come under this section, are highly relevant, to do with the quantum of the employment floor space, the quantum of the affordable employment floor space. The quantum of the affordable housing on site is obviously zero, and the size of the affordable housing contribution, which by my calculation represents less than one, well, fewer than one unit of housing.
So that's three questions, isn't it?
Probably.
The first is on the affordable workspace.
Well, no, the first was on the quantum of workspace totally.
Okay.
The second was on the quantum of affordable workspace. And the third was on the quantum of the affordable housing contribution. And actually, the fourth question is, we generally don't go for off-site, but I can see why you couldn't build it off-site if you're only allowing 150,000, because that wouldn't build you a single flat.
That's right. Okay, so Barry, the doesn't quite meet the 60% new requirement. Could you talk us through that one first?
Yeah,
I think
perhaps I'll share my screen again and go back to that slide from the presentation, if that helps. Okay, can you see my screen? Yeah.
it's just coming up. Yeah.
Yeah, so it is the case that it doesn't meet the 60% target. The policy says 60% subject to viability. So that's the key factor here. The viability of the scheme has been assessed, and as you can see from the outcome in terms of the surplus to be put towards affordable housing off-site, it's just about breaking even. So when considered in that context, the cost of amending the design of the scheme in order to achieve a slightly higher proportion of commercial to meet the policy would mean that the scheme would no longer be viable. To give you an example, the ground floor plan that you can see, my cursor should be hovering over it now, because of the way the commercial space is laid out, if you wanted to have commercial space on floors further up the building to replace residential space, you would need to have additional access through additional separate cores or separate stairs, or you might have impacts on the layout of the residential units that would be detrimental to their quality. So for those reasons, and based on the commentary in the economic viability report for the commercial space that's online and was part of Office's assessment, we feel that the maximum economically feasible amount of employment floor space has been provided, therefore it's in compliance with the policy. So that's the quantum issue.
Okay, so the second one was the affordable housing issue. Why only 170,000, I think, was the question.
Was affordable workspace next? Should I cover that, given that we're on the
Okay, sorry.
the same the same issue? So yeah, the affordable workspace provision has changed, but the policy has changed, and that's the key reason why it's different to what it was. Originally, it was 24% of the proportion at a 20% discount on market rates, and that was significantly exceeding the policy in terms of the proportion of floor space. The policy saw 10% of the commercial floor space. On this occasion, we have 11.5% of the overall commercial floor space at a 40% discount, so 60% of market rates. So it's a significantly better discount than was previously sought. This is the new policy. The policy again requires 10% of the proportion, so at 11.5%, we're still exceeding it. So I think the reason for the reduction is a direct reflection of the increased discount. But overall, it's still an exceedance on policy. It's still providing the space in perpetuity, whereas such controls on employment, on rental levels don't currently exist. And as such, it's a key benefit of the scheme and a key part of what's sought as a priority in schemes in priority employment areas.
Okay, and then affordable housing.
Affordable housing, it might be a good time to bring James in now, so he can maybe talk through how we arrived at that final contribution and the circumstances surrounding why it's different to the one that was secured previously.
Can I just intervene here? I mean, this is an employment area, so we are not looking for affordable housing. If there is any financial obligations to, if there is any financial monies to be made out of this site over and above, it will go into office space because that's what we're trying to achieve. The original application, I remember, had some affordable housing on it, and officers negotiated it out in order to get more business space because it's a business designation. So we're not targeting affordable housing. Is that right, Barry? And you can take over from there.
Yeah, that's correct. So because it's a priority office area, the priority is to provide employment for space in the first instance. So if it's a choice between affordable housing and employment space, then employment space is what the policy looks to promote. But as I mentioned, we feel that the maximum feasible amount of employment has been sought. Therefore, it's appropriate for us to look to see if the viability of the scheme can provide any further contributions towards affordable housing, given that none is being provided on site. And that's how we've come to the conclusion that, you know, through the viability process of that payment in lieu. So yeah, maybe James can jump in now and explain how we got there.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Chair. So I think it's worth just taking a step back first and just a quick summary of what viability is, regardless if the policy is to maximise commercial space or affordable housing on site. We're basically testing how viable it is to deliver the proposed scheme. So if the outcome of that assessment shows that the residual land value is less than the benchmark land value of the site, then it would be deemed that the site wasn't viable to deliver the proposed scheme that appraisal suggested. In this instance, we've tested a commercial-led scheme at 54%, and it's pretty much broken even with a small surplus of circa £157,000 left over, which has gone towards an off-site affordable housing contribution. But the sum that with the assessment that's taken place is we've looked at the gross development value of the proposed scheme. So that is the value of the proposed residential units and also the proposed commercial space, including the affordable workspace, and then taken off all the costs of the development. So that is the construction costs, SIL costs, Section 106 costs, the benchmark land value of the site, and also the developer's profit, which is deemed as a cost as well. And then the outcome of undertaking that assessment, we've looked at what is the residual sum of money left over, and that's what we've arrived at. So as the Chair has described, in the first instance, we're trying to maximise the commercial floor space on the site. If we looked at a 100% residential scheme, then the amount of affordable housing would be far higher. We'd have on-site affordable housing at a much higher rate than what we're currently proposing. But we're trying to balance a few things here. It needs to be viable. It needs to provide a commercial-led scheme. And then if anything is left over, previously, we were, I recall at the time of the last committee, we were of the view it should all go to improving the commercial offer, but members at the time shared the concerns about the lack of affordable housing. So it was considered anything that was left over could go to an off-site contribution. And we followed the same procedure this time around. And just to summarise, if that sum was bigger, based off if the off-site contribution was larger than what it is at present, then the scheme would be deemed to be unviable, because either the profit margin to the developer would be below the developer's benchmark profit margin, or the site value would also be below the benchmark site value. It'd have to be one of the two. So the money for affordable housing would have to come out of one of those two things, and it wouldn't meet the NPPF's policy guidance on how viability should be assessed.
Thank you. There's been some criticism about the drop from 700,000 to 157. But basically, you've simply done a recalculation of all of this. Is that how that's sort of come out?
That's exactly it, Chair. It's every single input that goes into the appraisal has been thoroughly scrutinised. What we actually did, we instructed a commercial and residential valuation specialist, that's also up commercial, to value the existing site. So that's the existing use value of the site, the gross development value of the scheme. So they valued the residential units and also the proposed commercial space. And we also got the build cost reviewed as well. So these are some of the major inputs into the appraisal, and all those were assessed by third parties. That's all attached to the council's viability report, which is on the website. So there's been a robust scrutiny of all those inputs. So once you've got your GDV, once you take away the costs, there's only so much money left afterwards, and that's basically what we've tried to determine, and that's why we've reported the figure that we've reported. I think the reason why it's reduced is because the costs have gone up since the time of the last appraisal. The GDV has gone up, but also the costs have gone up as well. So the viability review is the balancing act of all of these individual items in the appraisal, and you can't predetermine the outcome. It will be what the difference is of the gross development value less the costs, and that's the exercise that we've undertaken here, and this is the outcome.
Thank you. Katie, did you get your answers out of that?
I think roughly speaking, yes.
Okay, thank you. Steve?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to raise the issue around the cultural use, so 5.3.13 onwards. If I understand correctly, Barry's interpretation of London Plan HC5 is that as long as it's re-provided and that meets the policy. But I mean, my interpretation is it doesn't say re-provide existing cultural venues and facilities and uses. It says protect existing. So I'm just if Barry could go a bit further on that, that'd be useful, please.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the wording of the policy is protect existing cultural venues, facilities and uses where appropriate. And I think, in this case, when we have an application for redevelopment of the site, we need to consider it in the round as a planning proposal. So we've got buildings with an existing condition, which is not a particularly high standard in many respects, a proposal which would provide an improved standard of employment floor space within an employment area, at improved sustainability standards compared to the existing building, which also provides residential units in line with housing supply policy objectives, and which provides a host of other benefits, which, when considered in the round, help justify the redevelopment proposals. And in terms of whether or not the existing use should be re-provided, I think in a scheme like this, we need to consider what's being proposed. What is being proposed is a re-provision of floor space which could accommodate a similar cultural use. And in that respect, I think, as I mentioned before, I don't think we could reasonably refuse the application on the basis that that floor space isn't suited to the particular operational requirements of the existing occupier. So I think that's our position on that.
Chair,
Thank you.
can I ask a
on.
follow-up to that?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barry. It can't be conditioned and it can't be guaranteed that the floor space would be used by cultural kind of uses after the redevelopment, though. Is that right?
It's conditioned to be kept within the use class, the particular subsection of the Class E use class, so that it can be used for any uses that can operate within that class. But the layout of the space is such that it's designed to appeal and accommodate studio spaces. So in that respect, it's doing really as much as it can to keep a cultural use on the site, bearing in mind that the particular needs of the existing occupier aren't necessarily being fully accommodated.
Chair, I think I'm to take that as a no.
I think that is a no, is it? So it's the use. We can't say we want cultural or photography or any more specific than the use class, which it seems to be office stroke workshops.
I don't think we would seek to restrict to a particular occupier or a particular type of occupier. I think cultural uses isn't always specific to one particular type of, for example, photography studio, and we would want to make sure there was sufficient flexibility so as to meet the wider objectives of the employment policies.
And again, Stephen?
Thank you. It was more actually, I hear tell in the addendum of a letter from the GLA, which hasn't been provided to the committee. Is there any reason why it's not been provided, or I understand that there's that officers feel it's being addressed.
Letter was written to Barry and myself at 12:30. There's a bit of, Barry went back to the GLA to challenge them on it, and you've got a summary in there. But if you want to, Barry, if you want to tell us more about this letter that turned up at 12:30, who it was from, what it said.
Yeah, it's probably useful just to explain the background. So the GLA's culture at risk team, which are different to the planning team, they made a representation on the previous submission. So the January 2019 report includes a brief summary of their position. And their summary was that the draft London plan had policies protecting cultural uses and that affordable workspace for creative uses should be provided. I approached them to see if they wanted to make any further comment on the scheme, given that we were doing this week consultation. And I received a response which said basically that their position was the same, but that their comments should be updated to reflect the fact that the London plan has now been published, which I put into the report. But then this morning we received, well, 12:30, we received this letter from the Culture at Risk team, and basically it sets out. I summarised it, I think, succinctly in the report, but effectively it says. It outlines the role of the team in terms of protecting culture at risk. It provides a brief summary of what the proposal is in terms of the loss of the studios. And then it talks about the potential loss of cultural infrastructure. And it provides a kind of a neat summary, which is quoted in my report in the addendum, which is, it is the view of the Culture and Community Spaces at Risk programme that the proposed development risks a loss of cultural infrastructure. So that was the point that I went back to them on, because they make further reference below to the scheme not being contrary to planning policy, but they clarify that that was just them summarising the position of some of the amenity groups that have objected to the scheme, rather than it being the position of the GLA's culture team. So he confirmed that their position is, as I just read out, about the development risking a loss of cultural infrastructure.
Barry, I've got a question on this. How would you reserve a building of any size, shape or whatever for cultural or creative uses? I mean, we've got a use class that is called office and business, or G or whatever it is. I mean, is there such a possibility of reserving this building for a cultural use?
I think this is something that I think was covered last time around in terms of, what are typical cultural uses. The studios is clearly a cultural use, but it happens to fall within a use class where, non-cultural uses can occupy in the same way. Whereas there are other use classes where it's a clearer distinction between the cultural use and other uses. can be made. So in some respects, cultural uses can be protected through the use class order by imposing particular use classes. For example, subsections of class F, museums, F1C being an example. But alternatively, and the London Plan mentions this, about identifying and promoting clusters or cultural facilities through the plan making process. So I think it may be possible in that respect to protect uses through the plan making process. But in terms of what we've got in front of us, which is a proposal to re-provide a similar type of floor space that could be occupied by a cultural use, again, it just comes back to that argument about would we reasonably be able to refuse that because it doesn't suit the needs of the existing occupier. And again, the answer I believe is no.
So there is a use class of creative industries.
There's use classes. So for example, use class F has subsections for displays of works of art, museums, public libraries, for example. Whereas studios fall within a use class which is use class E, and the subsection being use class EG. And that use class also has other uses, for example, convention office, which maybe don't have the same cultural value, but its use class order is different, basically.
Okay, I think we understand that now. Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Barry. So in terms of the provision of employment space, I do think there's some inconsistencies. If we look in the addendum at 5.35, sort of, it's been criticised because there isn't much access to natural light. I mean, it doesn't sound like very good employment space, but here it seems like the officers are justifying that because they're saying for studio occupiers, natural light is often not a requirement. But then we're told that we're actually not protecting that specific usage. So it seems like where it's convenient, we are sort of saying, well, it's going to be re-provided. So where there isn't much light, then that's okay for what they want to do. But where there isn't the height, well, we haven't got re-provided. So that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem like a fair approach to me. And just while I've sort of got the mic, I think it would be quite useful if we could see that letter, the committee. I haven't seen it. And I would like to go back.
1 minute, let's finish.
Well, other people spoke at length. I'd really like to go back to the housing because I don't think 50 flats can just be, described as an add-on to employment. It's 50 flats. It's a big development, and I think that the affordable housing contribution is really paltry when we've got a housing emergency, and I don't think they sound very good quality either. There's been criticisms about them not being dual aspect, so I think we need to talk about the housing in more detail.
Barry, so
should I leave it there?
There's two things there, Barry, please.
Yeah. So on the first point about the basement space not having natural light, so I think that's something that we acknowledge, and it is the case that the space was designed, and I think potentially the applicant could provide a better account of the sort of background and how they got to this point. But my understanding is that initially the attempts were to try and accommodate Holman Studios in the new development, but I think agreement couldn't be reached. But part of that process was trying to design space that could be occupied by a studio occupier, a photography studio, for example. It's worth pointing out that other cultural uses, studio uses, would also not necessarily have a need for sunlight, such as music studios. So that's why this type of space was provided within the scheme. It's provided a basement level with quite high floor to ceiling heights, which is an additional expense to the development in terms of trying to accommodate this type of cultural use. So I take the point that where we can't be bespoke to one particular occupier, but I think again it falls back to we're trying to re-provide the cultural use on the site, but we just can't require the development to meet all the operational requirements of one specific occupier. There could be another studio which would happily take on the space. I think it kind of comes back to that issue, but hopefully that answers the point. It's probably worth mentioning as well that there is a light well providing light to part of the basement, and it would be possible to adapt some of that space for use in a more conventional sense if necessary. So it's not the case that all of the basement space is provided with poor light, and also it amounts to about 20% of the overall commercial offer, and we have to consider the proposal in the round, and by and large the standard of accommodation, office accommodation, is considered to be acceptable.
Can I just intervene on that second question about affordable housing? The policies, Claire, do not look for affordable housing on this site. They look for employment uses. And the calculation that James has described is done to support the position that the council has taken. And so I don't quite understand which bit of that you don't understand.
So, as it's 50 units, I would have thought it would have still been seen as a major housing development.
Okay. Barry, can you explain position again?
Yeah, it is a major development, so there is a need to provide affordable housing if possible in light of other policy priorities. But yeah, in this case, because it's a priority office area, the first priority is to have a policy compliant amount of commercial floor space, which, as we've mentioned, the maximum economically feasible amount has been provided. So only after that has been exhausted do we look at whether or not we can achieve affordable housing. I think it's worth pointing out that there are various other schemes in priority office areas where we've taken a similar approach, where the affordable housing contributions or provision on site has not been as high as other non-commercially led schemes, but because of the employment designation, the priority has been to get the employment floor space.
Thank you. And you asked to see this letter. Do we have a copy of this letter? This gentleman, 1 minute, sir, 1 minute, sit back down. Legal officer, we've got a copy of this letter and my colleague would like to see it. Is that okay? Okay. If you'd let people see it.
Chair, we've got enough copies to hand out to the committee officers and the applicants team.
The only other thing to add, did you want a short adjournment to give members time to read and digest? It will only be
If
fair.
Claire wants to read, anybody else want to read this, or we're not accepting of the summary? Okay, so can we have can we have 5 copies then, please? Yes, we will. Okay, I've seen this, so this is 1. Andrew, would you give that to Claire? Have we got enough copies to share them around? We'll have a 5-minute adjournment for you to read this. And after you've read this, I do need to give Barry the opportunity. He went back to talk to these people, and because there was some misunderstanding, I think, as to what they were presenting. I want to say something. So Barry, I saw your correspondence and you went back to the GLA and asked them what their actual position was rather than what that stark bit at the bottom was. I wonder if you could tell us the story.
Yeah, so the final two paragraphs, I think that because it's the final paragraph says the proposal would result in the loss of a world-class cultural asset, undermining cultural and creative industries, contrary to planning policy as set out in the London Plan and Hackney Plan. And I appreciate in the line before that, they said these views are best summarised, but I thought it was a bit ambiguous to finish the representation with that quote, and that it may be interpreted as being the position of the GLA is that this scheme is contrary to planning policy as set out in the London Plan. So I asked the officer to clarify that, and they confirmed. In fact, I'll give you the exact text of what they said. Bear with me. Sorry, 1 second.
It's the dreaded Google threads.
Yeah, apologies for this delay, my mistake.
I've got
Yeah,
it.
so I am my query was, can you confirm that you were just summarising the position of objectors in the last sentence, and that's not the GLA's position. Your position is that it's a loss of social infrastructure, a risk to social infrastructure. And he confirmed by saying the GLA's position is that the proposed development risks a loss of cultural infrastructure. The part you have quoted is a summary of the objectives view as highlighted in the report prepared by the committee. So he's clarified that that final bit is him quoting and is not necessarily the views of the GLA Culture and Community Spaces at Risk team.
Who are not the planning team?
Who are not the planning team, no. They deal specifically with spaces at risk. Yeah, it's a particular remit on that.
Thank you. Sarah, I think you were next.
Okay, I don't think anyone's going to be grateful for me going back to the question of cultural use, but I'm going to. In the paragraph quoted by the judge who decided the JR, he or she said something about we don't need to protect the specific and bespoke use. So there's been quite a lot of conversation about the specific user, the current tenant, I think you're a tenant. I'd like to understand better what's wider than specific and bespoke use. So I understand there isn't a sub-paragraph that says film and photography studios that this could be protected under, but I'm not clear about whether we could say, actually, if this is going to get rid of or reduce film and photography space in London or in East London, that would be one of the grounds that we might refuse on.
I think I can help you because I go back to the first meeting when we thrashed a lot of this out. And the developer, I think the architect is here, told us that there are large spaces, large open spaces that are designed for such things as photography. But it doesn't, and we concluded it didn't fit the requirements of Holborn Studios. I think if we ask the architect what it was designed around, the spaces there, that would help this question. Architect, please.
That one? Oh, I'm alive. Okay. Yes, when we were looking
1
at
minute,
the
Sarah,
scheme-
if you'd put your light off.
Oh, sorry. Yes, throughout the process, when we've been looking at the scheme, we've looking at the design of it being for a photographic studio, because we've looked specifically at the basement space and the way that it's been designed. There is a very deep transfer slab at ground floor level, which allows any columns on the coming down to ground to be spread to the perimeter of the building and then that allows it to be clear space within the basement, and we've got a range of sizes for a range of studios that can accommodate photography.
Excuse me, sir, you
And-
can't speak.
And we've specifically increased the height of the basement to approximately 6 metres to accommodate large volumes, infinity screens within the design.
Thank you, please do leave.
Can I ask if that includes film as well as photography use?
The purpose of putting it into the basement gives us a black space, if you like, which allows us to accommodate, whether it be photographic, film, where all the light can be controlled from within the space. That was the purpose. So we didn't want to bring it up to ground level, where obviously then you've got a blackout, etc. So, and you've also got to deal with sound as well. By taking it down into the basement and creating this effective, more than double height space, probably not too dissimilar to this room, that allows you then to manipulate and use that space as you wish. And by moving all the columns to the perimeter, and I would say as well, the external walls are 1.5 metres wide. So again, they accommodate the structure so you can deal with a vast clear space.
So to follow up on that, the objectors are obviously saying, and they've said in their objections, that they don't think this space could be used for film and photography. So I don't know if they're right. I don't know if you're right. But if they're right and it's not possible, what other cultural uses have been considered in this design? So what are you thinking you'll use it for within this broader use class?
Do you want me to answer that one?
Well, I expect it's probably a question for the owners rather than the architect.
Well, I suppose if I could start, I mean, what we have is like a blank canvas. Yes, it's a black space, but if you think of installation art, for instance, that could still be used as galleries. Music studios were mentioned earlier as well, because being down in the basement, you've got the sound. I think you've got a vast volume and flexible space that can be used for many cultural activities. I mean, take for instance, I think up on York Way in King's Cross, you've got the orchestra down in the basement of the press building there. So, okay, it wouldn't be of a scale of theirs, but there's nothing to say you couldn't put a theatre in that space as well. There's a whole range of activities that could be used, but the focus has been predominantly towards photographic and film.
Thank you. Can I go on to my next question?
Yes, please.
So this question about the target of 60% minimum, 60% commercial space. Can I check with the officers whether that's 60% minimum or 60% full stop? So if it's 60% minimum, that would feel very different to 60% is the target, that's all we're seeking to achieve.
Okay. So it used to be, before Barry comes in, it used to be more than 50%.
Yeah.
And we would call it business or office led. My understanding is that's gone up to 60%. And if you think that this was previously designed under the old regime, it's a reasonable, I think it's a reasonable position that we don't draw the line at 60 because the thing's been around for so long. But Barry, if you could answer that question rather than mine.
Yeah, it is a minimum. Let me just get you the exact wording of the policy, but it says, second. Yeah, it says new development within designated POAs will be permitted where it is employment led and where B1 use class is the primary use in line with the below thresholds subject to viability. And for the Wenlock POA, it says at least 60% of the office floor space across the area as a whole is B1 employment floor space. I think that the key sentence there, the key part of the sentence is subject to viability, which is the part that we have justified the current proposal against.
Thank you. Any
Thank
more?
you. Two more.
Two more.
One on viability and one on biodiversity. So I still don't fully understand viability. How much profit can the company make before it's deemed to be a surplus. So
So
if their
that's a
profit's seen
James
as
question.
cost, yeah, the profit's seen as a cost taken into account within the viability assessment. At what point do we get into excess that can
James,
be
please.
housing, go towards affordable housing? I mean, it is quite shocking to see 750,000 reduced to 150 something thousand.
But we'll have an explanation for you now.
Sure, yeah,
James.
happy to answer that. Thank you. I mean, so developers' profit margins, you don't work off the amount in pounds. It generally works off a percentage, which can be based off as a percentage of the gross development value, or in this instance, it was a percentage of the cost. And developers' profit margins will vary scheme to scheme, because they'll take into account many different factors of the scheme. It's basically kind of it accounts for the risk of developing out certain schemes. So some schemes will be more risky than others. So the more risky the scheme, the higher return the developer will need. So this is what I referred to previously as the kind of benchmark profit margin. In this instance, if I just look at the appraisal, just to make sure I'm correct, we targeted a profit margin of 20% on cost, which in the appraisal, which is in the documents, showed a return of 16.36% on GDV. So that profit margin, that range, is in keeping with what is generally accepted for similar schemes across London. So a more risky scheme might require a higher profit margin. A less risky scheme, as I said, could perhaps undertake this for a lower profit margin. But taking account of the size of this scheme and the kind of complex nature of it, this was deemed the appropriate profit margin in this instance. I can't fully recall now off the top of my head the original viability assessment prepared on behalf of the applicant may potentially have targeted a slightly higher return, but this is what Hackney deemed to be appropriate in this instance. So when you look at it in kind of it's a significant sum. It equates to circa £10 million. Clearly, that's a lot of money, but that is the return that the developer needs to undertake this development, part for a whole number of reasons. But one of the main kind of things that sets the benchmark return is the return that banks require to fund the development. So for the banks will have their benchmark, or they refer to it as the hurdle rate that they're prepared to lend money at. And if it goes below that rate, they won't lend money and the scheme will be deemed unviable. So this is the rate that we deemed required to be required in this instance for this scheme to be viable.
So are you saying that banks won't lend money for a scheme which will make less than 20% profit?
No, I'm not saying that. That will vary. And the way viability works is there's different takes on how to arrive at the appropriate profit margin and the different elements of a scheme in terms of the commercial element, the residential element. Often people apply different profit margins to reflect the risk. And in the residential, the profit margin will vary depending on if there is affordable housing or if it's a private-led scheme, and there'll be a different margin to reflect the risk of both of those. And the thinking behind that is that affordable housing generally will be sold in advance to an affordable housing association, who will pay money upfront to the developer, which de-risks the scheme. So they get money upfront and then money throughout the construction period. So if a developer was bringing that kind of scheme forward, then it would be de-risked so that they'd accept a lower profit. Whereas for private housing in a scheme, there's obviously a significant sales risk to the developer. And whilst at current day, the appraisal is based off current day values, that's where we consider values to be today. But by the time the scheme is built out in the future, values could have dropped. So there's obviously a margin in there to allow for changes in circumstances as well. So whilst it is a significant sum of money, it is the required return. The developer needs to hit that hurdle rate to get funding from the banks for the development to come forward.
And James, is that an accepted figures or, you know, I mean, how do you benchmark this? Is it through, you know, you haven't just dreamt this figure up, have you?
No, no, we haven't, Chair. So as I said previously, there are various rates that you see in viability appraisals, and there's a lot of debate around this as well. So when these are reviewed, often consultants acting for councils will have a different view to the consultant acting for the developer, and that is the discussions that both sides have with each other, and hopefully we find a resolution somewhere in the middle. But in this instance, it was what we would refer to as a blended rate. So we didn't target a different profit margin for the residential to the commercial. We arrived at a blended rate of 20% on cost. But if you took what the rates that you often see in viability assessments for schemes of this kind of size and nature, you typically target 15% on GDV for the commercial space and 17.5% for the residential space. And I actually ran that. I also looked at the appraisal with kind of being more explicit and put those inputs into it. And it basically came out with the same answer. It was very similar to 20% on cost. So I'm quite comfortable that the profit margin here is in keeping with profit margins for schemes of similar sizes and risk profiles across London.
Thank you. Okay.
I've got one more question. on
Okay, we'll have one
biodiversity.
more, and then we will have a break because I'm instructed to give you guys a break. We do need a break, I think. But one more, Sarah.
Thank you for that, James. So on biodiversity, on the pictures that we have got in front of us, the pictures that you showed, I couldn't quite get a handle on how much biodiversity was proposed to be improved, albeit the presentation said it was going to be improved. So could we just hear a bit more about how biodiversity is going to be improved? I'm happy. If you want to do that after the break, fine.
No, let's do that.
Yeah, so perhaps I can call up the urban greening factor drawing to give you an idea as to the extent of greenery to be provided. But I think the first place to start is the existing buildings on site. So obviously they cover the majority of the site apart from an area of hard standing in the courtyard, and they're built almost right up to the edge of the marina jetty, whereas the current proposal is set back from the canal and it includes an additional area of courtyard space as well as green roofs. So if I just quickly get this on my screen, I'll try and be quicker than I have been last couple of times. So this is the urban greening factor document, and this is a drawing which shows the different types of urban greening that will be provided. And obviously urban greening has a number of benefits. It's not just about biodiversity, but it does improve the biodiversity of the scheme. So along the canal edge, there's planting for shrubs, there's green roofs all across the development, apart from on the historic retained buildings. And then there's tree planting, climbers, and some permeable paving. So overall, the biodiversity is a substantial gain, I would say. It's certainly a net gain, which is what's sought by policy compared to the existing situation, which it doesn't provide a great deal in terms of biodiversity enhancements.
Does that do? Okay, so we will have, it's 20:05, we'll come back in 7 minutes, so 2012, 2013, if we can. Thank you. Okay, Barry, you still there?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Great.
Sorry, I had one final question on the first point, if that's all right. Just on the thank you, Chair. Could I just check, is it a material planning consideration around the affordable low-cost workspace that my understanding is that the current entire workspace is affordable, but is not sort of a statutory affordable. It's just sort of it is low cost versus the 11.5% that's coming in the new development. Is it material planning development to look at those two things together?
Okay, Barry, did you get that, Barry?
Yeah, I got it, I think. Yeah, it is material. The fact that the existing floor space would constitute low-cost floor space is material. And it's covered in my report. I'll give you the paragraph number. But basically, we need to consider the policy which says that low-cost floor space should be re-provided at the same rental rates and service charge and arrangements as the existing, if there's a willingness among the existing occupier to stay on. So given that that appears to be the case here, we've assessed that part of the policy. And given that we've achieved the maximum economically feasible amount of economic floor space within the new development, we need, and that we would be getting affordable workspace at an amount that exceeds policy, at an amount that is a genuine discount, and that would be secured in perpetuity through a legal agreement where that arrangement isn't currently in place. We have to weigh whether or not that outcome is preferable to a scheme which sought to re-provide the entirety of the floor space as low cost. So I think the policy is, in this case, given that nearly the entirety of the space would constitute low cost floor space, I think it would be very difficult to accommodate a viable scheme which re-provided the entirety of that space at a low cost of rent. So we need to consider what's a viable proposition, and what's been put in front of us as we've been through on the viability side of things is just breaking even. It's providing the maximum amount based on the type of layout and the site constraints that are in place. So on that basis, we feel that the 11.5% affordable workspace offer is acceptable and satisfies that part of the policy, the part that relates to low cost floor space. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Sorry,
Yeah, thank
I
you.
put the microphone off. We'll go on to design and heritage considerations. I don't think this is being challenged very much, but if Tim, could you tell us about, there was a suggestion that we were losing valuable buildings. I wonder if you could respond to that, please.
Hi, Chair, it's Matt. I can jump in there. So we have carried out a detailed assessment. There was actually a walk around the site that was carried out back in 2015 with Historic England. And what we identified was that the Canal side warehouse, the L-shaped building, is very significant, and that's being retained. And also the other area of significance that is important to retain is the chimney, the very tall chimney that's going to remain a landmark along the canal. So when we walked around the site, the other areas, Barry, it might be useful if we bring up the aerial view of the overall site. The other areas have either been very heavily altered. So when the image comes up, there's some other buildings next to the canal which are 19th century, but they've been altered, they've been painted, they've got new windows in them. The view that we came to in discussion with Historic England was that those buildings are less significant. And then the remainder of the site, so that's the building you can see that's painted white with the pitch roof just to the right of the chimney. So that building's been very heavily altered. And So the agreement there, or the assessment there, was that that building had lost a lot of its significance. And as you can see there, so you've got the chimney that's being retained, and you've got this L-shaped building, which is almost in its original form. The later additions are going to be removed, so that the asset's going to be revealed. It's going to be making more of a positive contribution. And then just turning to the rest of the buildings, obviously you can see the sort of flat roofs and the various pitched roofs, and then the other longer building fronting on Eagle Wharf Road. A lot of that dates from the 1950s. So again, when we did this walk around, our view was that it was less significant, and that on balance it was acceptable if those buildings were lost. Now, we have recognised that that does cause some harm. So as set out in the report, our assessment is that causes less than substantial harm to the conservation area. But overall, in terms of the balance, we think this is outweighed by the overall public benefits that the scheme brings. So yeah, so in a sort of wrapping that up, we're happy with the buildings that are being demolished because they are of lower significance.
And has there any new policies that we are taking into account that we should worry ourselves about?
We've taken account of the changes to the MPPF, but what happened was that various paragraphs were sort of shifted around. So in the earlier report, the assessment referred to 196, paragraph 196 and 197. And so we've updated that because it now refers to paragraphs 202 and 203. But the overall assessment and the meaning and the wording is virtually the same. So our overall assessment is the same as back in 2019.
Okay, thank you. That's probably as good a summary as we want. Is there any questions on this? Stephen?
Thank you. Can I just confirm, is the entire site locally listed, or is it just aspects of the site that are locally listed?
The entire site is locally listed, and it was locally listed back in 2012. And that was based on various criteria: historic interest, architectural interest. What we didn't do in 2012, and what we don't tend to do when we do local listings, is do a sort of thorough assessment of every building, particularly as this is a sort of complex of buildings. You know, there's quite a lot going on there. So that was 2012 when we did this sort of overall local listing and drew a line around the site. And as I said, in 2015, we actually did a thorough walkabout with Historic England to identify the areas of significance. And on the back of that is where we've come with our overall assessment of harm.
And again?
Sorry?
Thank you. Me, sorry. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the answer. I just want to address the chimney and the listing of the chimney in particular, and obviously that is of relatively significant heritage value for the sort of canal scape, as it were. Obviously, the sort of part of the point of the chimney is that it's sort of above everything else in the design, and this is sort of going into the design a bit of the building. It's very much crowded by the other buildings around it. So how does that impact on the sort of heritage sort of value of the chimney itself? And then I suppose that also does sort of read across to the L-shaped building as well, surrounded by the larger new build buildings.
I guess the first thing to say is there is some benefit in the sense that there's a lot of ad hoc sort of bits and pieces around the chimney at the moment, so you can't really appreciate it at the low levels. Whereas that's all being taken away, that's less significant. And so it will sort of stand alone and you'll be able to appreciate it more. I do take your point about the building coming quite close. But our overall assessment is that, as you can see, the upper part is set back and it still remains a very prominent landmark along the canal. So our overall assessment is that it does retain its sort of prominent landmark status.
Claire.
Thank you, Chair. I was thinking about the height and massing of these buildings. What's nice about the canal is, you know, you can walk along and you've got light at the moment. That's presumably going to be quite blocked out now. These buildings look taller. what's the precedent for this? And are we saying just because there are already some tall buildings, then it's a free for all and we can go higher and higher and higher? Or, I mean, how many tall buildings along this canal is enough?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, we probably wouldn't really define these as tall buildings. In terms of the canal side context, buildings up to sort of 6 or 7 stories are quite common. That's sort of an emerging context. You've got the building to the west, which I think is 6 or 7. And Barry mentioned the other scheme, Sturchyards, to the east, which that has elements up to 7 stories. So it is sort of contextual, and that is considered an appropriate sort of canal side scale and massing. But we wouldn't support sort of tall buildings next to the canal, as in, you know, much taller buildings.
And it's important to say that the envelope of the buildings, the massing and the height, etc., has been accepted previously by a committee. And so that is a pretty strong material consideration. And you'd have to see you'd have to think about a policy change really in order to reconsider that. Is that fair? Natalie's nodding. If she could just expand on that, that would be good. Yes, bottom.
Thank you, Chair. That's correct. So, see, this has been considered previously, and Barry alluded to it earlier in his presentation. But yeah, perhaps Matt can expand on all of the considerations that were previously given.
Well, I think one of the key things to say is that back in sort of 2015, this went through a full design review process with the CUDS team, and it went to the DRP. I think possibly twice. I think it went to the DRP. So there was that dialogue that happened and various changes made. And yeah, we think it's a high quality design. We think it's respectful to the heritage assets that are being retained, and it gives them enough space. And it's in appropriate materials. And we will be getting all of those materials by condition, and we'll also be getting mock-ups as well. So we'll get to see what the building will look like prior to full construction.
And if I could just add to that, Chair, that we consider the design to fully comply with the current policies in the London Plan and our local plan. Is that correct, Matt? If you want to add to
that is correct. So yeah, so just in terms of the policy context, there were some updates. We have looked at those, so we've recognised that you know where the various updates are in the London Plan, and we're satisfied that this scheme is in line with those policies within the London Plan and with LP 33, the local plan.
Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just question your guidance? How do the 2 legal cases interact with the previous decisions of the committee? Do they not stand, given that there was a legal process afterwards? And also, I'd just make the point that I wasn't even a councillor at that in the first time. Never mind being on the planning committee. So this is a new committee.
Christine, is that one for you? I think I asked that in the call over.
Sorry, Chair, could you repeat that, please?
Could you? Go on.
Thank you. Sorry, could you just explain to me how, given the Chair's guidance on previous decisions of this committee, how the legal opinions, the legal cases interact with that, given that there was a heavy steer that on massing, etc., then that had already been discussed previously and essentially approved by previous committees.
Right. In summary, any previous decision and is a material consideration and to be taken into consideration with the information, the documents and what's being presented by the officers tonight. So it is a material consideration, if that is the gist of your question. Yeah.
Any more? Okay, so we can go on now to quality of accommodation residential 5.5. One more then. Claire first, please.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, obviously, it's all market housing, and the London Plan does say we need to build market housing, but between 2005 and 2019, we actually built an excess of market housing in Hackney. So I wonder if that, maybe you can advise me if that's got any bearing on decisions like whether or not to allow these kind of developments, which are adding to an oversupply of that. My second point is on family accommodation. The majority of these units are 1 and 2 bedroom, which isn't what's in highest demand in the borough. So it's not much family accommodation. And there's not much dual aspect either, quite a lot of single aspect. And I know one of the objections was that these flats might overheat, and that's a significant problem with new builds, especially new builds with lots of glass just facing in one direction. I mean, it really is a serious issue for residents. I have a lot of casework on it actually. So maybe some comments on those points, please. Thank you.
Barry, is that you?
Yeah. Okay. So the first question was about oversupply of market housing. I think it comes back to the point about this being in a priority office area and the priority to be to provide employment floor space. And obviously the policy seeks affordable housing in schemes of a certain size, and this qualifies, but the priority is for employment floor space, and that's what's being prioritized, which is why we've ended up with the affordable housing contribution that we have. So that's to answer the first question. And the second point was about single aspect. So this is referenced in the report, and it's acknowledged that the London plan does provide some additional guidance on this, the new London plan. It is the case that not all of the units are dual aspect, but overall, given the orientation of the site, the provision of outlook and daylight to the units being broadly acceptable, the units are considered to be of an acceptable quality. And I think in terms of the overheating impacts of having single aspect units, generally speaking, the single aspect units are not south facing. But even still, the overheating assessment that's been done as part of the sustainability statement has shown that the units are policy compliant in terms of meeting a level of comfort that is considered acceptable. So the final point then was on mix. So again, it's acknowledged in the report that the scheme does not fully meet the policy in terms of mix, particularly for family size units. 20% of the units are family size as opposed to the third sort in policy. However, given the constraints of the site and given the overall provision and the need to maximise or to optimise housing supply, the unit mix is considered to be acceptable. And as with the point about single aspect units, as was the case previously in the January 19 committee, the mix hasn't changed, and the policy is the same in terms of the targets for market sale housing. So I think that needs to be borne in mind as well when we're considering an assessment of housing mix.
Thank you. So this has previously been accepted.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. Steve?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to raise 5.5.5, the communal open space. So on the, says on the employment density of 529 should ideally meet 2,116 square metres of communal open space. Then talks about a child yield of 10 or more to provide 10 square metres per child. Doesn't go into any detail about what is being provided per child, but it says that there's an overlap if necessary. So the proposal is offering 1,265. So on the basis that, you know, the maximum fine or the minimum is 2,116, is that's around about sort of 55% of what would be classed as ideal by the policy. Is that correct?
Barry,
it falls short of the policy target that's acknowledged in the report. And it is the case that it's not fully meeting the child play space targets or the open space targets for residential and commercial. But given the constraints of the site and the rather unusual context where it's on the canal, and there's obviously constraints there in terms of how you can provide open space, but also the quality of what open space is provided is quite high, given that it has that amenity of being on the canal. The provision of open space is considered to be acceptable. the submission included a child play space statement, which covers the new policy in the new SPG on Hackney's SPG on child-friendly homes, and it's gone through the process of the tick box exercise there. And the space that's being provided is considered to be of a high standard, and there is a condition recommended which seeks further details in that regard. So I think overall the quality of the space is considered to be high, and the provision, although falling short of the standards, is considered to be acceptable for this particular site in this context with its particular characteristics.
Thank you. On to impact to amenity. I don't think there's been any change there. Is that fair, Barry?
Yeah, the impact, the envelope, the massing envelope is unchanged. So the daylight sunlight impacts are the same. The privacy impacts are also broadly similar in terms of the positioning of windows, etc., and their relationship to neighbours.
Thank you. Claire, please.
Thanks, Chair. So it was just another quick one on the housing. I noticed that the lift wasn't going to all the floors. Could we just expand on that? Just thinking about how residents would access their flats. Are there 2 stairwells? Thinking about fire safety there.
I think it might be useful to bring the architect in on this point, Chair, if possible.
Okay, the lifts. Can you explain the lifts, please, architect?
There we go. Yeah, all the floors or the access, all the floors are accessible by a lift, but on the very top of the building, we've got some duplex units that are accessed from the floor below. So the entry level is all accessible from a lift.
Okay, but then you go upstairs to your bedroom or whatever. Yeah.
Duplex unit at the top of the building.
Okay. That makes sense.
There's a staircase lift in every core, and I haven't counted them as I'm here now, but everywhere is accessible by stair and by lift. And then, like I say, as you get to the top of the building where you've got duplex levels, your entry level is at the floor with the lift. You go into your front door, and like a conventional house, you can have a staircase up to your bedroom. No, we've complied with building regulations, and there's been a fire strategy report as well, because you introduce, if you like, a lift core and a stair and a separate stair dependent on the scale of the building and the travel distance between your front door and the lift. These are also under 8 stories, so we're complying with the building regs where you can have a single stair and lifts as your means of escape. A staircase and lift in each core, but there's a number of stairs throughout the building. Yeah.
Sarah.
Just going back to the point you just made about something that hadn't changed since the last application. As I understand it, if something's a material consideration, it's relevant. Material means relevant. It might mean highly relevant. Doesn't mean we can't make a fresh decision today. So if we take into account the previous court decisions as material considerations, we could still, as a separately constituted new committee, make a different decision on any aspect of this application. Is that right?
You could, but you need to behave reasonably, and the reasonable position would be to be consistent with previous decisions. And if you came up with if there was a good reason to take a different view, or you weighted it differently, I guess, then clearly you could. But that will be, that will have to be defended should it go to appeal, you see. And the requirement, as you know, is to be reasonable. Is that fair?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to clarify that the previous JR decision, what can I say? That one of the key findings of that decision was that members needed to retain the opportunity to access all materials relating to this application. And I think you will have seen, having read the officer's report, that the officer has spelt out how he tried to ensure that this application for you before you tonight that you can say that he complied with the judge's decision and to ensure that everything was available on the council's website. And it's up to you as members at the end of the day to decide what information you want to retain, to study, in order for you to make an informed decision here tonight. I think that's the key thing I want you to get and understand from the previous JR decision. I'm sorry if I might have confused you before, but that's the key thing tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was about
Thank you, sir.
viability, wasn't it?
And that's right, and it was mostly in relation to the viability. The other two grounds were dismissed, thrown out. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Right. Yes, of course.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, there's obviously a principle of consistency in planning. So any decision that you make tonight must be based on any changes in material circumstances since the last decision.
Thank you. Right, we're going to go on to impact on amenity. I think we've decided that we'll move on from that. Impact on canal users. I don't think much has changed there. Biodiversity and landscaping. We talked about that earlier, didn't we? That there is a new requirement in terms of cover. Is that right, Barry? Urban greening. That's it.
That's it. Yeah, urban greening factor. Yeah. And it meets the requirement for a scheme like this. It meets that requirement.
So these are new issues, you see. So we can, if we think that the urban greening is not up to scratch, and that outweighs all the other things, you could throw it out on the basis that there's not enough urban greening. Is that?
Just to check on the urban greening on the roofs. So there are green roofs or whatever they're called. I'm picturing this as kind of grass on the roof or something
Cedar,
similar.
yes.
Is there any moss? Yeah. Is there any provision for us to require that to be upkept? It's quite common to see these green roofs looking absolutely lovely when the building's first built and then dying. That's quite common in Hackney.
Yeah, there's a condition requiring details of the green roof. I think if the condition, if the green roof is installed in compliance with the type of standards that we would seek, then it should be able to thrive. So if the substrate depth is deep enough, it should be able to thrive. The condition, I don't believe, has a requirement for a maintenance plan. It's not something we normally require for green roofs, but it is something that if members wanted to, we could potentially look to include as an addition to the condition.
Okay, we'll talk about that at the end. Traffic and transportation, there's some comment about cycling. We've changed our standards on cycling since the last time we considered this. Cycle parking.
Yeah, that's correct. Maybe Kasim would like to come in on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Barry. So since the last time we've assessed this application, the policy standards haven't changed. We've just kind of been more aware of the quality of cycle parking that was going into developments. So I suspect you're referring to the 2-tier cycle parking standards. So the standards around those have not changed. We've obviously previously assessed this and deemed it acceptable. We do encourage and push for a higher quality of cycle parking, preferably a single-tier Sheffield stand solution. But in this case, because of the previous approvals and the negative impact that any kind of push for single-tier cycle parking would have on commercial space, in particular, I believe, and other uses, was deemed it was deemed a difficult argument to make. Barry may want to add further as to what impact requiring further single-tier cycle parking could have on uses.
Yeah, I think they've accommodated as much as is practically possible without having to redesign aspects of the scheme, which would have a knock-on effect on the portion of employment for Workspace, which we've already discussed, and scheme viability. which again is, as we've mentioned, is just about breaking even. So I think on balance, the provision of cycle parking is acceptable. On that green roof issue, the condition does require a maintenance plan, so that's covered in the condition.
Thank you. Energy and sustainability. Have there been any changes there? Barry.
Yeah, there's been quite a few changes in that particular area, particularly in the London plan. I think there's quite a few to go through, but I think probably it's worth covering the there's a greater desire to see existing buildings retained wherever possible, and the principles of the circular economy that are set out in London Plan policy should be applied to new developments. This scheme is not referable to the GLA, so there was no need to provide a circular economy statement or a whole life carbon assessment. However, we have taken into consider the benefits versus harm of the building being lost in sustainability terms. And given that the existing building is rather old, its condition is not particularly high condition in most parts of the building, and certainly in terms of its sustainability credentials, it's not particularly high performing. Given that the new building would be built to modern sustainability standards, and given the overall scheme benefits that we've discussed, we think that it's justifiable in this case to for the building to be demolished and the new building retained. We do have an addition to the construction management plan condition, which requires the submission of the site waste management plan. So through the discharge of that condition, we can ensure that as much of the materials that are demolished on site can be reused, and that any disposal is in line with best practice in terms of minimizing waste. But if you had any further questions about the more technical aspects of how the sustainability regime has changed and how the scheme meets that, we have our sustainability consultant on the call, so they can provide some further details if you have any specific questions.
Okay. No questions on that. So other planning considerations. So this is about waste, air, land, drainage and fire safety, which you alluded to. Fire safety is a new thing, isn't it? I don't know quite why it's come into planning, but we've done something on that. Barry?
Yeah, there's a need to provide a fire statement as per the new London Plan policy. And that's been provided and been assessed by the Council Building Control team, and there's been a little bit of back and forth on it, but they're happy with the document that's been assessed, that's been submitted. So yeah, in terms of meeting the new London Plan policy on fire safety, we believe the scheme is in compliance.
Thank you. Any? No? Community infrastructure levy, so the costs must have gone up, etc., but it's the same sort of idea, is it?
Yeah, there's been some changes to the schedules, but so the figures are slightly different to previously, but the overall principles are the same.
And planning obligations must be similar. Is there any additional ones?
Yeah, the most noticeable one is the way we calculate carbon offsetting has changed. We have a higher value attributed to the amount that must be paid per tonne, which has led to a significantly higher contribution. That's also had an effect on the viability, actually. But there's also been some changes to formula-based contributions, including local labour. But yeah, it's just everything is as per the new planning contributions SPD, which wasn't in place when the previous scheme was brought, when the scheme was previously brought.
Okay, any more questions at all? Any thoughts from anybody? Brian. Oh, we've got lots of thoughts. Brian.
I suppose I'm going to find it much more difficult to support the scheme this time because of the lack of a reasonable affordable housing contribution. And I've heard the arguments about that, about the viability and about the priority officers give to Workspace. And I just would have applied it differently. I would have applied less Workspace and more housing contribution.
What policy would that be based on?
I think you could reduce the amount of Workspace for Workspace by a small amount and be within our policies.
Do you think we could sustain that argument?
I'm not convinced we couldn't.
Okay. Perhaps, I don't know if you can come up. So who wants to respond to that? Because that's an important issue.
Thanks, Chair. I wonder whether we need to just go back to the viability consultant just to explore that a little bit further.
Okay. James.
Yeah,
James,
thank you. Yeah, sorry. Do you mind just repeating the query just so I'm sure I've got my head around it, please?
Well, Brian thinks that we should change our position on the office space priority in order to yield some affordable housing funding.
Okay.
Chair, so if I could just add, sorry, just to add to that, I think the concern was about the fall in the affordable housing contribution compared to the last time the application was presented to members. And I just wondered, James, whether you just could clarify whether that's in part due to changes in the viability inputs, or whether that's linked to the employment policy.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Well, it's all linked to it's obviously all linked to the viability. That's what we're assessing, and the viability is assessed in accordance with the policy. So the viability, as I said before, the scheme in front of us is 54% employment led, and then of that employment space, I believe the policy is that 10% of it should be affordable workspace, with a 40% discount to market rents. So my understanding of the question was, if we were to reduce the quantum of affordable workspace, would there be a higher affordable housing contribution? And yeah, the answer to that would be yes. But my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Barry, but that would then not be policy compliant, because the policy dictates that it needs to be a minimum of 10% affordable workspace. So this is basically it's kind of there's a kind of pyramid here of things that we need to comply with. And first of all, it is a commercial-led scheme. Then it is affordable workspace, and obviously all the other policy requirements. And as I said before, the residual, if there's anything left after all of that, due to officers' concerns that last time we considered this case, it was determined that any leftover money would go to an off-site contribution to affordable housing, and we followed the same process. But unfortunately, due to changes in the overall scheme viability, due to the passage of time and construction costs going up and various other things changing, then the amount left over is now not what was previously agreed.
Thank you.
But George, did I understand correctly that the policy is 10% and we've achieved 11%? Is that correct?
Yeah.
That is correct. Just on that, I kind of see the point you're getting at. Reading between the lines, you're asking, well, why are we above that and there's not more for affordable housing? I believe in the grand scheme of things, I think the 11% affordable workspace offer is probably the most sensible solution based off the floor plate of the space. The applicant can correct me if I'm wrong there, but 1% of the affordable workspace is not going to lead to a significant affordable housing contribution. I still believe members would have the same feelings that you have about the existing offer, with whatever the difference was between doing that. It wouldn't really make or break the scheme.
Thank you. Katie, please.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, the previous decisions of the committee are material considerations. I don't think that's in dispute. They're material, but they're not binding. This application is similar to, but not identical to, the previous two applications. And I was here for both of those. And I did vote for them because I thought that a refusal could not be sustained at appeal. And that was, the reason for my vote then. Now, tonight, there are some things that are different from previous rounds of this application. And lots of applications that we see at this committee fall short of some aspect or other of our planning policy. And that's not at all unusual. And we often say it falls short here, but it makes up for it over here with these other benefits. And what I'm not seeing tonight is the other benefits that make up for these shortfalls in terms of the employment floor space, which doesn't meet our target. Some of these are new policies that weren't available to the committee to apply when we previously considered this. In particular, I was very persuaded by Councillor Race's arguments about protecting existing cultural venues. Then we have dual aspect flats, which is again a new policy that was not in place last time we considered this. I think it also misses our target for family housing. It massively misses the target for play space. I suppose you could say that that sort of goes with not having family housing, so there won't be any children to play there anyway, but that's not the reason for the target. So all things considered, Chair, I think we're perfectly entitled to come to a different view on this for those reasons.
Thank you. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. I think from my perspective, I broadly agree with Councillor Hanson's contribution just then. So from my interpretation, it misses on HC5 the protecting existing cultural assets. It misses on the LP27 the workspace reaching 60%, which means that in that interpretation it's not business led, but then it also fails in that case on any sort of affordable housing sort of contribution, which we have a policy on, that we are very proud to have a policy on. It's got the harm to cultural assets, which I do remain concerned by, and by the design around at least one aspect of the remaining heritage asset. And it also misses on LP48 and LP50, which is the open and play space. Now, on the flip side, it does offer an increase in workspace generally, a net increase in workspace, and secures in perpetuity 11.5% of affordable workspace, which isn't secured at the moment, though that is obviously a reduction of the sort of affordable workspace across the entire kind of current site. It's 50 new homes, which obviously we do need. We do need homes in the borough. They're not necessarily the sort of, we do need to build private sale homes, market sale homes, and then there's obviously the SIL contribution. But I think on balance, it misses a huge number of our policies. So I'm not sure that the officers in the report reference significant benefits of it, which offset the missing policies. But I agree with Councillor Hanson. I'm not seeing those significant benefits in this.
Okay. Anybody else? Councillor Young.
Just very briefly, I agree with Councillor Hanson, and that has led me to look at this in the round. And looking at it in the round, I'm not convinced.
Okay, let's move to a vote. Claire. Yes, of course you can. 1 minute, let's have Claire as well.
I don't want to hold everyone up. I mean, I think most of the concerns have been outlined by my colleagues very well. And I think an important point to note is the introduction of the new London plan, which does seem to seek to protect cultural uses. And I think the quality of the housing that's going to be offered to our residents is substandard, really. I mean, there's a clear intention in the London plan to avoid single aspect dwellings. And I think this could have been done in this application, but they just wanted to get as many 1 and 2 beds in there as possible, is my, is what I'm guessing at. But I just wanted to quickly let the objectors just have the floor again and just basically maybe outline for us why they feel that the London plan protects cultural uses, if indeed they do think that, and maybe tell us why they think, or if they think we should refuse on that basis.
The objectors you're asking.
Yeah, I'm very happy to take that, if that's okay, Chair.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. London Plan Policy HC5 protects existing cultural uses, and we need to start there. I think it seems from some of the arguments I've heard on behalf of the developer that the scheme, for whatever reason, is unable to deliver your policies because there's always something which is unviable. So we have an important cultural use which can't be re-provided because it's not viable. We've got workspace policies which can't be delivered because it's not viable. We're in an employment-focused area, but we can't give you your policies when it comes to employment floor space because it's not viable. Everything doesn't seem to be viable, and you have policies to protect these really important uses for a reason. The only thing that can seem to be done, which is viable, is the provision of very expensive flats, which for all the reasons you set out, don't then meet your policies when it comes to play space, aspect, daylight, quality. So yes, I mean, I think for us, it's those land use concerns which really go to the heart of it. You've got policies in place which seek to protect all of those, and the scheme doesn't deliver the planning benefits.
Please.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and Councillors' point about the last decision not being binding is correct, and obviously members are free to make the decision based on all of the considerations available today. Given that we had the, oh sorry, should I just project? Is that better? Do you want me to repeat what I just said? Councillor Hanson is correct in saying that the previous decision isn't binding, and members are free to make a decision this evening. What I was going to suggest to members is, obviously we had the late comment that came in from the GLA culture team today. I wondered whether it would be at all helpful to defer the item to get the view of the London plan, the GLA London plan team, in terms of compliance with the policy, whether you would like us to report back to committee based on their views.
Okay, can I say something then? Substantively, absolutely substantively, we have assessed this for a number of years and have come to the conclusion that this scheme is a good scheme, and we could not sustain a refusal on the basis of what we've seen. We have had judicial reviews about things that were to some degree on the margins but quashed the decision. We've come back with, we had a judicial review, the latest one, that had 3 grounds, 2 of them were lost, and the one about viability during the period when viability was changing massively was led to the quashing. I have to say that the minor issues that we've gone through this evening, that Barry and the officers, please don't say anything. The minor issues do not substantively change the precedent that we've got in front of us, in my view. And in my view, if we vote to throw this out, then we will lose very badly at appeal. And that will cost the council in terms of consistency, of policy making, and I think that's disappointing. But I don't think you want to defer. Is there anybody who wants to defer this? No. So we have a recommendation. The recommendation is approved, conditional planning permission, subject conditions and legal agreement. All those in favour, please show. Are there any against? That's 5 against and 1 for. Thank you very much indeed.
Chair.
Yeah.
Just in terms of procedure, could we just get the legal officer to confirm? So the vote was obviously not to agree with the officer recommendation. Okay. Christine, would you be able to just advise what the next steps are?
Sorry, Natalie, could you repeat that, please?
just in terms of the next steps, as the decision wasn't voted for, in terms of the officer recommendation.
Sorry, I thought that members voted, the chair read out what the recommendations were within the report.
Can I intervene?
Yeah.
Over the years, we've done this differently, I have to say. And the custom and practice is that we line up those that are against, and we don't do this very often. That's why we're getting into a mess. Is that the members tell us what their reasons are, and then you go away and put it into some sort of
Chair, could I just add, what we've done previously is members have given the reasons, which are then written up by the officers and circulated for us to check that what's been recorded reflects the committee's decision.
I think I'd just like a short adjournment to discuss with the legal officer on the best way forward.
I agree with that, Chair, a short adjournment, because the way in which it normally works is that you give up members time to make
So for public here, we're just trying to work out what we do to actually record our decision properly. So Christine, our legal officer, tell us how we go about refusing this.
Right. Our understanding of the Constitution is that members will sit down tonight and explain their reasons for refusal. And it needs to be, as you know, material consideration, policy compliant. The motion would be carried forward. It needs to be seconded. And then afterwards, we'll have a short adjournment as to whether or not what was said, your reasons for going against officer's recommendation is, sorry, I'm getting confused. Start again. We're going to have a short adjournment after members tonight decide why they're turning
Sorry, Christine, 1
officers'
minute.
consideration.
1 minute.
Christine, can I, I've got some.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
getting confused,
that's
sorry.
okay.
Christine.
Members, so what needs to happen is a member who voted against the recommendation should put forward an alternative opposite motion explaining the planning reasons behind that recommendation in the context of the MPPF and the development plan. That motion must be seconded by another subcommittee member. So that's the first stage. And then I will discuss that with the legal officer once that's done.
Agree.
Okay, so who wants to propose this?
I'm happy to do that, Chair, if that helps the committee. So I formally propose that we refuse this application on the grounds of taking the areas of where there's new planning policy first. I would say number one reason would be to do with protecting existing cultural use. Number two reason would be quality of the new accommodation, in particular in relation to dual aspect. Subsidiary reasons would be failing the targets on employment floor space, family housing mix, and play/outdoor space.
Okay, do we want to accumulate any more?
We could add something about the London plans seeking to protect cultural uses. Oh, sorry, missed that one.
Brian wanted some more housing somehow. You should change the policy on, we should have less.
No, it's more that I disagreed with the way the officers applied it, in that they applied it to achieve more than our policy of affordable workspace, and therefore negated a bigger affordable housing contribution.
Okay. So they went for 11% rather than 10. Was that what it? Was that it, Brian? They went for 11 rather than 10.
Yeah. See, as Katie just put it, seeking to maximise the affordable workspace at the expense of affordable housing, or put differently. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else got any more? Then we'll debate it, I think.
Chair, just to sort of expand on that, I think what we felt was, if it is going to be employment-led and that's why there is no affordable housing, it should at least meet the employment floor space target. Because if it doesn't meet either, then you can't say that one stands in for the other, is how I would put it.
Exactly. Can I add the heritage local listing as well, please?
Just in terms of procedure, Chair, we do need the motion to be put forward and then seconded.
Okay.
So I think we just need
then,
to.
shall we? Can we? Have you got it? Yeah.
I have formally moved it, Chair, so perhaps you could invite someone to second.
Okay. Let's. Can we read all those things through that you first started with? I'm sorry.
If you want.
Have you written it down?
I have a note, but it's rough.
So I said number one was protecting existing cultural uses, is it? Whatever the wording says here. Cultural venues, facilities and uses. Number 2 was the quality of the new accommodation, in particular in relation to the lack of dual aspect under the new London plan. Actually, the new London plan is 1, 2. And then subsidiary reasons were failing employment floor space, family-sized housing mix, and play space. What I said in my speech earlier, Chair, was most things fail some policy aspect or other. Everything we see fails some policy. The question is whether the good things outweigh those fails. And I was saying this fails on too many things.
And we were not seeing anything to balance that. For example, affordable housing.
In fact, what we were seeing was a lot.
What do you want us to do now?
So that motion needs to be seconded.
Claire?
And my recommendation is that we bring back a detailed report setting out those reasons for refusal to the next planning committee meeting, so you can formally vote on that.
Chair, while I wouldn't be against that, we have done this by correspondence before. So I wouldn't rule out being able to do it by correspondence, because the other thing is not everyone in this committee will be at the next planning committee because there's an election in between.
Well, let's try and improve it with correspondence. But if there's any issue, then it really needs to be done here by the sound of it.
The next meeting is the 6th of April.
6th of April.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if it can come to that, but we have done it by correspondence before without, to the satisfaction of committee members and officers, in my recollection.
Chair, could we have a short adjournment?
Yeah,
just
that's
to
a short
check that
adjournment with my
before we
legal
make
officer,
any
and
decision
then we can
tonight,
decide.
because
Yep, adjourned. Okay, so the legal officer tells us that she will bring a report back with a recommendation that will need reconfirming. Is that right?
Thank you, Chair, that's correct. The correct way is definitely not with regards to emails, not regards to anything correspondence. That is definitely not correct, and we'll do it with regards to a proper
Okay,
report.
so you'll take on board all that's been said, somehow put it into a reason for refusal, and then it'll come back to a future committee and we can confirm that. So these guys have got to come again if they want to see the.
They will need to attend again. That's
Yeah,
right. They
so-
will need to.
Okay,
And can I confirm
That's-
it'll only be those of us who sat through this application who can vote on that?
The next time you come back with regards to voting, with regards to the recommendation and what the reasons for refusal, that is it. It wouldn't be the whole thing all over again.
that the legal officer will produce a reason for refusal. And if you're content with that, or you want to add something, I guess you can debate that at the evening. And that will form the reason for refusal.
Councillor Bell was asking a different
Yes,
And it
question.
will, sorry.
Well,
was
will
the
it be
question?
only the 6 of us who have sat through this debate tonight who can vote on that for the motion?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Can only the 6 of us vote on that?
6 of us who actually sat
Well,
through the
yes,
hearing.
it's just this.
Okay, so we'll try and get it before the end of our term, Brian. So you can gloriously refuse this. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Just for the ambiguity.
Just to mention, there are delegated decisions. Please read them by ward.
Chair, are there any other business items?
There are no any other business items.
And as mentioned, the next planning meeting is on the 6th of April.
6th of
April.
6th of April. Got to preserve the 6th of April. If anybody has.
It is in members' calendars.